The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless frequency at 0200 hours, a sound like electricity trapped in glass tubes. Natalie Hayes pushed through the ICU doors at Cedar Creek Medical, her sneakers making no sound on the linoleum, muscle memory from a different war, a different life. 12 years. 3 tours. 2 purple hearts sewn into memory she no longer accessed during daylight hours. Nobody at Cedar Creek knew this. Nobody was supposed to. She moved through the corridor with the practiced invisibility of someone accustomed to being overlooked. Night shift nurses existed in a kind of shadow world. Day staff owned the hospital. Night staff merely maintained it, changed bandages, checked monitors, documented the slow hours between sunset and dawn when nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. That was the agreement. That was the line Natalie had been living for 8 months. Her assignment was Admiral Richard Voss, recovering in room for 12 from wounds sustained in Baghdad. Not the Baghdad of Natalie's tours, that was 15 years behind her. This was a different operation entirely. The Admiral had been investigating something. Stolen medical supplies. Funneled through contractors. The kind of corruption that happened quietly, in the margins of larger wars, while everyone watched the headlines. Naval intelligence wanted eyes inside Cedar Creek Medical. They wanted someone who could move unnoticed, ask questions that didn't raise flags, document what shouldn't exist on paper. They wanted Natalie Hayes, who had spent 3 tours in field hospitals performing surgery under mortar fire, to become invisible again. To become someone else. Just a nurse. Just another tired face in scrubs. She clocked in at the nursing station without making eye contact with anyone, the badge clipping to her collar with a soft metallic click. Her left leg carried her forward with a slight limp, shrapnel from an IED outside Fallujah, 2007, a piece of metal still embedded against her fibula because the army surgeon said removing it would cause more damage than leaving it. Pain was information. She had learned that young. Dr. Marcus Pierce sat 3 stations down, hunched over his laptop, his reading glasses reflecting the monitor's glow like twin fluorescent moons. Natalie had learned to read him across 8 months the way soldiers read insurgent movements, pressure patterns, behavioral tells, the small decisions that preceded larger ones. He was expensive, not in the way that suggested inherited wealth, but in the way that screamed carefully constructed privilege. His watch was a Rolex, probably $15,000. His shoes were Italian leather that cost more than Natalie's monthly rent. His wedding ring was platinum. Everything about him was designed to announce arrival, status, the kind of man who expected deference the way other people expected gravity. What Pierce didn't know was that Natalie could read him the way she could read a patient's vital signs. His shoulders were different today. Tighter. His jaw moved like he was working through a problem he hadn't solved yet. She had seen that expression before. She had worn that expression. It was the look of someone who had stumbled onto something he wasn't equipped to handle and was considering his next move with the precision of a man accustomed to making decisions without consulting anyone else. She made her way to Admiral Voss's room, the medication cart rolling smooth and quiet ahead of her. The Admiral was sleeping, not the deep sleep of the healthy, but the fractured rest of someone whose body was healing from catastrophic trauma. The IED that took his vehicle had also taken something from him he couldn't quite articulate when he was awake. Natalie had read his chart obsessively. Bilateral shrapnel wounds. Chest trauma. Internal bleeding that had required surgery 4 days ago. The surgical report mentioned extensive damage to his thoracic cavity, wounds consistent with blast detonation at close range while investigating a supply depot outside Baghdad proper. She approached his bedside with the silence of a ghost, checking the 4-line that fed medication into his system. His chart lay on the bedside table, and she photographed 3 pages with her phone, a device that technically didn't exist in her medical record, paid for with cash from a bank account that existed nowhere officially. The photographs captured medication orders, pharmaceutical inventory codes, billing references for drugs that seemed unusual for his presenting injuries. Too much. Too many doses. She had been trained to notice inconsistencies, to document them, to ask questions that sounded innocent. Why was the Admiral receiving fentanyl in quantities that exceeded standard post-operative protocols? Why were there charges for medications that weren't on his chart? Why did the pharmaceutical deliveries list items that didn't correlate to any patient need she could identify? Her hands didn't shake. They never did. She had held hearts in her hands, actual human hearts, during open cardiac massage in a forward operating base outside Fallujah while mortars exploded in the courtyard outside. Her hands knew what it meant to be steady under pressure. A medication chart was nothing. Questions about supply chain documentation were less than nothing. She completed her assessment of the Admiral's vital signs. Blood pressure 118/72. Heart rate 64. O2 saturation 96% on 2 liters of supplemental oxygen. Breathing was steady, strong. The man was healing faster than expected. His body was built for survival. Natalie recognized the signs, the musculature of someone trained, someone military, someone accustomed to pushing through injury like it was merely an inconvenience. The Admiral's eyes opened slightly as she finished her notes. They were gray. Military gray. The color of an Atlantic in winter, storm-bound and resolute. How long? His voice came out like gravel. Recovery or discharge? Either. Both. 2 weeks minimum for discharge. Full recovery? Months. She met his eyes without hesitation. This was the choreography of hospital care. Ask questions. Provide information. Don't linger. You're healing ahead of schedule. Good. He closed his eyes again. Too much time to think. She said nothing. Thinking wasn't listed in any medication protocol, and her job, her real job, not the cover, required her to ask more questions before she left his room. Your pharmaceutical orders came in this morning. Want me to walk through them? Already reviewed. His eyes stayed closed. Something feels off about them. The question came too quickly. Too knowledgeable. Natalie registered this data point and filed it. The Admiral was aware. Not asleep. Not recovering. Waiting. Like she was waiting. Probably nothing, she said carefully. Inventory codes don't always match what's delivered. Contractor errors. Or intentional ones. His eyes opened now, fixing on hers with the intensity of someone used to being obeyed. You notice things other nurses don't, Hayes. He knew her name. Of course he did. His file would have contained everything. He was naval intelligence. She was naval intelligence. This entire moment was a conversation between two people who operated in the spaces between what was said and what was understood. I pay attention, Natalie said quietly. Patients do better when you do. He closed his eyes again, the moment passing. Keep documenting. Everything you see. She left his room and moved toward the medication station, her mind already processing what had just transpired. The Admiral had been watching her from the moment she arrived. That meant naval intelligence had flagged something about Cedar Creek Medical that required human confirmation. That meant whatever Natalie was documenting would matter. She worked through the medication cart methodically, cross-referencing charts against deliveries, noting discrepancies. 2 units of propofol that didn't correlate to any surgical procedures. 3 vials of vecuronium listed as administered to rooms where patients had been discharged or transferred weeks ago. Fentanyl patches charged at a concentration 40% higher than what should have been needed for post-operative pain management. The pattern was there if you looked for it. Most people didn't look. Most people trusted the system. Most people weren't trained in field medicine where survival meant noticing what was missing from a supply cache before your team needed it. That was when she became aware of Dr. Pierce watching her from the nurse's station. Not casually. Not the way a physician supervises nursing care. The way a predator assesses threat level in an unfamiliar territory. His expression shifted when he realized she had noticed him. He looked away, reaching for his phone. His mouth moved silently, forming words meant for someone else. She couldn't hear him from across the corridor, but she recognized the body language of a man making a decision that would have consequences. Natalie finished her medication audit and stored the cart in the locked cabinet behind the nursing station. She had 10 more hours until her shift ended. 10 hours in the same building as a man who was beginning to understand that she was not what she appeared to be. 10 hours until she needed to contact her handler and report that her cover was fracturing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce wasn't just noticing her. He was beginning to understand why, and that meant he was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with medical competence. He had something to hide. Something worth protecting. And he had just realized that she was the person most likely to find it. She returned to the charting station and pulled up the medication logs for the past 18 months, documenting the pattern she now saw clearly. $12,000 in phantom billings across 73 patients. Medications charged but never delivered. Contractors paid for supplies that didn't reach the hospital. The kind of corruption that required someone on the inside. Someone with access. Someone with authority. Someone like Dr. Marcus Pierce. The fluorescent lights hummed on. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. And somewhere in the facility, Natalie Hayes began the careful process of documenting evidence that would, in exactly 16 days, end everything. Thursday morning at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like industrial antiseptic and burnt coffee. The grand rounds corridor stretched down the third floor like a gauntlet, white walls fluorescent bright and unforgiving. Natalie Hayes stood against the eastern wall in her scrubs, hands loose at her sides, watching Dr. Pierce hold up her patient assessment chart like evidence of a crime. 12 residents surrounded him. For attending physicians. One nursing director taking notes. Pierce's voice had the particular cruelty of someone who knew he had an audience and intended to use it. This, he said, raising the chart higher, is what dangerous incompetence looks like. The interns leaned in. Natalie's jaw tightened but her eyes remained flat, cold as winter water. Nurse Hayes documented a pain scale discrepancy that doesn't exist, Pierce continued, his voice echoing off tile walls like a sermon. She recommended we investigate medication dosing patterns as if she possesses the clinical judgment to question physician orders. As if her night shift observations carry the weight of medical school. He turned to the residents with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Perhaps our little night shift Nancy Drew should focus on emptying bedpans instead of playing detective with pharmaceutical records. One resident snickered. Another whispered something to his neighbor and they both glanced at Natalie. Pierce waited for laughter that never quite came. His smile tightened. Natalie didn't blink. Didn't shift her weight. Didn't give him the trembling lip or the burning face he was fishing for. She simply held his eyes with a kind of stare that made his institutional power feel suddenly, impossibly small. Your need to diminish me, she said, voice pitched low and steady, says more about your insecurity than my competence. She turned. Walked away. The sound of her shoes on tile was the only noise in the corridor. How dare you, Pierce sputtered behind her, but she was already past the nursing station, past the medication dispensary, down the back stairwell where the air was cooler and the fluorescent lights didn't buzz quite so aggressively. What Pierce didn't understand was that her composure was a weapon. His escalation required her to break, to cry, to react with the emotional vulnerability he could weaponize further. Instead, she'd simply stated a fact and left him holding it. He'd swung at air. That image would visit him later, her face, unmoved, while his voice cracked behind her. 2 days passed. Natalie's schedule changed. She was reassigned to the pediatric wing, 3 buildings away from Admiral Voss's floor in the ICU, away from the supply records she'd been carefully documenting for naval intelligence. The move was strategic. Pierce had figured out enough to know she was a threat. He couldn't prove it yet, but he could remove her from proximity. Move the board before she completed her investigation. On Tuesday afternoon, she retrieved a cold brew from the vending machine on the 3rd floor, the one near the administration offices. Pierce materialized with 2 hospital board members, both wearing the exhausted expression of men who'd already heard a complaint. Nurses who think they're doctors, Pierce said loudly, selecting a protein bar with deliberate slowness. Never ceases to amaze me. Next she'll be demanding surgical privileges. Probably be safer than letting her near medication reconciliation. The administrators laughed. That particular kind of laugh that was more relief than humor, the laugh of people in power confirming to each other that power was justified. Natalie collected her cold brew and walked past them without breaking stride. Her jaw clenched but her face remained controlled, impassive. She didn't acknowledge him. Didn't dignify it with anger or tears or defensive words. She simply existed in the space he was trying to diminish her within, refusing to shrink. The pediatric assignment became permanent the next morning. She was moved entirely off the ICU rotation, off Admiral Voss's care pathway, off the critical care floors where pharmaceutical documentation existed. The message was clear: stop asking questions or stop working here. Pierce was escalating. Not with louder yelling anymore. With institutional leverage. With a competent deployment of power. Wednesday arrived grey and humid. Natalie worked her pediatric shift, teaching a 7-year-old named Emma how to use her inhaler, documenting vitals, moving through the motions of a career that was quietly imploding. That afternoon, during her break, a security guard appeared in the break room. Tall man with a radio clipped to his belt and the particular weariness of someone who didn't enjoy what he was about to do. Dr. Pierce wants to discuss some liability concerns, he said. Not a request. A notification. His hand rested loosely on his radio as if he expected resistance. Natalie gathered her badge from the table and stood. Several nurses stopped talking. Eyes tracked her as she followed the security guard down the corridor, across the sky bridge connecting the pediatric wing to administration, into a beige office that smelled like drywall and corporate anxiety. Her locker contents were already there. Packed into a cardboard box. Her name tag. Her spare shoes. The small photograph of markers from his Naval Academy prep school acceptance ceremony. And a termination letter, official letterhead, stamped and witnessed. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway with 2 people from hospital counsel. His face held the expression of a man who'd achieved what he wanted. Documented pattern of insubordination, he said, not quite reading but citing from memory. Unauthorized access to restricted records. Failure to follow chain of command. He waited for her to react, to protest, to cry. She did none of these things. She simply read the letter with the kind of attention someone gives to instructions before performing a critical procedure. 6 disciplinary incidents were listed. Natalie recognized 3 of the dates immediately. November 14th at 0200 hours. November 27th at 2345 hours. December 3rd at 0415 hours. The night she'd photographed Admiral Voss's medication billing records. The night she documented the pattern of pharmaceutical charges for drugs never administered, a kickback scheme Pierce was running with a supplier, funneling cash through phantom billings. Those dates matched exactly with her Navy intelligence collection requirements. Pierce had discovered her investigation, or at least enough of it to know she was a threat to his financial arrangement. Her questions about supply chain documentation had become too specific. Her interest in pharmaceutical inventory had become too focused. He'd pieced it together, not all of it, but enough to want her gone before she could connect his fraud to something bigger, something that involved the Navy, something that involved Admiral Voss. Her cover was burned. "You're done here," Pierce said, his voice settling into something satisfied and final. "Effective immediately. You have 2 hours to clear out your locker and personal items." The security guard would escort her to her car. Protocol. Liability mitigation. The standard procedure for removing someone who'd become a liability to the hospital's reputation or Pierce's criminal enterprise. Natalie picked up the cardboard box. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice came out steady and measured. "I understand." That evening, she called her naval intelligence handler from her car in the Cedar Creek parking lot. Static, then a voice she recognized. "Handler 6, this is Reaper 2. Mission compromise. Subject's cover blown. Request immediate extraction. The handler took a breath. Affirmative. Final shift authorization? Negative. Physician subject has terminated employment. Intelligence gathering window closed. Another pause. Longer. Copy. Extraction confirmed for tonight, 2,300 hours. Bring everything you've compiled. Leave nothing out. The call ended. The mission ended. 16 days of careful documentation, 5 months of undercover work at Cedar Creek, 6 months of preparation before that, all concluded because Dr. Pierce had gotten curious about a nurse asking too many questions about medication records. She'd been this close to identifying the entire supply theft pipeline. Military contractors funneling medical equipment through civilian channels. Cost per item, $400,000. Volume per month, approximately 12 units. Annual fraud value, nearly $2 million. Admiral Voss had been investigating it from the military side. She'd been gathering evidence from the civilian side. Now the investigation would stall. The case would grow cold. Pierce would continue his kickback scheme, probably more carefully, probably for years. And her son wouldn't understand why his mother had been fired for supposedly being incompetent when he'd watched her work 16-hour shifts, when he'd seen her study medical journals at their kitchen table until midnight, when he'd heard other nurses ask for her advice on complex cases. Home was a quiet 2-bedroom in Buckhead, the kind of neighborhood where people didn't ask questions. Marcus was sitting on the front porch when she arrived, still in his Naval Academy prep uniform, geometry textbook open on his lap. He was 14 and already moving through the world with his father's careful observation, his grandmother's sharp intelligence, his mother's controlled composure. Long day, he asked. Natalie set the cardboard box on the porch and sat beside him. The evening air was warm and sticky, the kind of Atlanta humidity that made thinking feel like swimming. Yes. Did something happen? She didn't tell him that Admiral Voss, the man he'd spoken to exactly once at the Naval Academy recruitment event, the man whose career path he studied like scripture, was the patient she'd been protecting. She didn't tell him that her mission was over, her cover blown, that she was likely being reassigned to a desk position in Arlington. She didn't tell him that she'd failed. Just changes at work, she said. Marcus looked at her the way children look at their parents when they know they're being lied to and have decided not to press it. He'd learned this skill young. Too young. The price of having a mother who kept secrets for a living. He pointed to her jacket, draped over the porch railing. What's that? The faded unit patch. She'd sewn it inside the jacket lining 20 years ago, when she was something other than what she appeared to be, when she was visible and dangerous and not hiding behind a nurse's credential and a false name. 7 Medical Battalion. Baghdad, 2005. A patch from a lifetime ago, worn so thin the blue was almost grey. A long time ago, she said, and didn't finish the sentence. That night, after Marcus fell asleep, Natalie packed her equipment in a duffel bag, the photographs, the documented billing discrepancies, the supply chain evidence, the pharmaceutical inventory record she'd compiled by carefully accessing restricted files over 5 months. Everything Pierce had wanted her to stop asking about. Everything that proved he was stealing from the military and selling it back to military contractors at inflated prices. At 2,300 hours, a black sedan pulled up outside. No military markings. No visible insignia. Just a man in civilian clothes with the unmistakable bearing of active-duty intelligence. He didn't come inside. She carried the duffel to the car, placed it in the trunk, sat in the back seat as he drove away from her house, away from Cedar Creek Medical, away from the carefully constructed life she'd been living for the past 8 months. The sedan moved through Atlanta traffic with the particular purpose of a vehicle heading toward an airfield. Somewhere north, in the darkness beyond the city lights, a helicopter waited with Navy markings and classified orders. Her cover had burned. Her mission was compromised. And the next 24 hours would set in motion a sequence of events that no one at Cedar Creek Medical saw coming, events that would end careers and expose a fraud that reached far beyond Dr. Pierce's pharmaceutical kickbacks. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd prioritized her principles over her assignment, saved a life over maintaining cover, and now the entire supply theft investigation that she'd been tasked to document would collapse along with her identity. The truth didn't just silence the room. It was about to bring the hospital to its knees. The irregularities started small. A charge for cisplatin at 5 times market rate. Pharmacy records showing methotrexate deliveries that never appeared in inventory logs. Dr. Pierce sat in his office at Cedar Creek Medical, Atlanta, scrolling through Admiral Richard Voss's treatment billing, and something moved behind his eyes. Not concern. Recognition. The kind that comes when you realize someone is looking at the same numbers you're looking at and asking the wrong questions. He'd noticed her asking about pharmaceutical inventories 3 weeks ago. Casual questions. Too informed. A night nurse who understood supply chain documentation the way a cardiologist understands EKGs. She'd pulled the Voss file twice in 4 days. Checked the pharmacy reconciliation reports. Cross-reference medication charges against the actual medication stored in the locked cabinet. Her name was Natalie Hayes. She'd been at Cedar Creek for 8 months, reliable, quiet, exactly the kind of employee who should never ask questions about anything beyond her shift. Pierce leaned back in his chair. His suit jacket hung on the door, tailored Italian wool with a price tag that would have paid for her entire month's rent. On his desk sat a photograph, his boat. A 47-foot Azimuth moored in the Bahamas. The pharmaceutical supplier had been very generous these past 18 months. Very, very generous. And this night nurse with the steady hands and the careful questions was going to ruin it if he didn't move first. By Tuesday, the first fabricated incident report appeared in her personnel file. Failure to follow standard medication protocols during the 2,100 medication round. Witnessed by no one. Documented by him. By Wednesday, there was another. Disrespectful behavior toward a resident physician. Again, unsubstantiated. Again, his signature at the bottom. He was building something. A paper trail. The kind that would justify removing her from the hospital entirely. The kind that would hold up under scrutiny because he was a senior physician and she was just a nurse, and everyone knew who that equation favored. On Thursday, he made the calls. 3 phone calls to members of the hospital board, mentioning in his most concerned voice that they had a potential liability on the night shift. A nurse asking unusual questions. Requesting access to records that fell outside her scope of practice. Possibly unfit to work with critical patients. He didn't accuse her of anything specific. Specificity could be disproven. He simply raised the possibility of risk, and in hospital administration, the word liability worked like a detonator. Friday morning, her schedule changed. Her assignment to the 4th floor ICU, where Admiral Voss was recovering from his Baghdad injuries, where he lay in room 412 with wounds that still hadn't fully healed and questions about missing medical supplies that only certain people were asking, was stripped away. She was reassigned to the pediatric wing. The 3rd floor. Effectively removed from the Admiral's care team. Pierce watched her face when she saw the updated schedule on the bulletin board. She didn't react. She just turned and walked back to the break room, and that composure terrified him more than rage would have. Rage would have given him something to document. Rage was evidence. Silence was strategy. But that wasn't the worst part. The filing began in earnest on Saturday. 3 additional incident reports, all fabricated, all signed by Pierce, all carefully timed to specific shifts. Failure to properly document patient vitals. Medication administration error that resulted in no actual harm but read very badly on paper. Insubordination when asked to clarify her duties by a resident physician. By Monday morning, her personnel file looked like a map of incompetence. Pierce had done this before. Not often. Only when necessary. And only to people who wouldn't fight back the way administrators feared. people who would accept termination quietly because creating a fuss meant questions, and questions meant lawyers, and lawyers meant discovery, and discovery meant someone would eventually look at the billing patterns he'd so carefully constructed over 18 months. Natalie Hayes, whoever she really was, would have to go. The termination letter was prepared by Tuesday. Security was called. The HR director, a woman named Patricia Chen who had worked with Pierce for 6 years and trusted his judgment because his judgment had never failed her, reviewed the incident reports and nodded. 5 disciplinary events in 2 weeks. Clear pattern of escalating negligence. Liability risk. The hospital needed protection. At 0630 on Wednesday, a security guard named Mitchell walked upstairs carrying a cardboard box. Natalie was changing out of her scrubs in the locker room. She knew him. He'd always been respectful. He looked uncomfortable now, which told her something before he even spoke. Mitchell placed the cardboard box on the bench beside her locker. Her personal items were inside. Coffee mug with a faded Navy logo. A book she'd left in the break room. A photograph of a young man in a Naval Academy uniform, her son Marcus, taken 3 years ago. Your shift is terminated effective immediately, Mitchell said quietly. He held out an envelope. This is the formal letter. You'll need to surrender your badge and your access card before you leave the building. Natalie looked at the envelope. Her hands remained steady. She didn't open it. The security guard had already delivered the message. The envelope was just procedure, just the official confirmation of something that had already happened in Pierce's office and on his printed forms and in his carefully crafted telephone calls to board members. "Where's the paperwork?" she asked. Her voice hadn't changed. The same tone she used when ordering supplies, when communicating with residents, when moving through Cedar Creek's hallways, as if she was exactly what everyone thought she was. Just a nurse. In the envelope, Mitchell said, Dr. Pierce authorized the immediate termination based on disciplinary incidents dating back 2 weeks. You'll receive severance equivalent to 2 weeks' pay, and your health insurance coverage ends Friday of this week. There's a number in the envelope if you want to appeal the decision. She had no intention of appealing. Mitchell stayed in the locker room for another moment, then excused himself. Natalie sat alone in the locker room of Cedar Creek Medical, Atlanta, surrounded by the muffled sounds of the hospital waking up, the distant ping of the elevator, the intercom crackling with overhead pages, the hiss of the pneumatic door closing behind the security guard. She lifted her scrubs off the hook, folded them carefully, and placed them in the cardboard box alongside her personal belongings. The faded unit patch that was sewn into the jacket lining, the one that carried the insignia of the 7th Medical Battalion, stayed hidden where it had been for 8 months. Hidden, and waiting. The security office was adjacent to the main entrance. Pierce was there. Not by accident. He stood in the doorway with 2 members of hospital council, his arms crossed, his expression arranged into something that suggested grave concern about a personnel matter that weighed heavily on his conscience. When Natalie walked down the corridor carrying the cardboard box, Pierce's eyes tracked her movement with the focus of a predator watching prey cross open ground. "Captain Hayes," he said. She didn't break stride. He wasn't addressing her, not officially. He was performing for the administrators. "I'm sure you understand that we have a responsibility to maintain the highest standards of patient care. Your recent disciplinary incidents left us no choice." She stopped. Turned. The cardboard box held steady against her chest. When she looked at Pierce, her eyes were the color of a clear sky at 30,000 feet, blue, distant, entirely without mercy or uncertainty. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave from the deferential tone she'd used for 8 months. This was not the voice of a night nurse. This was the voice of someone who had operated a field thoracotomy with a combat knife while rounds impacted the wall behind her. "Your billing patterns are documented," she said quietly. $847,000 in phantom pharmaceutical charges over 18 months, all routed through Meridian Health Services, which is registered to your brother-in-law's investment firm. The stolen medical supplies from forward operating base Shank in Loga Province? traced back to contracts that you approved after receiving payments from 3 separate defense contractors. All of it. Every single transaction. Pierce's face went white. The lawyers beside him had stopped breathing. My handler has been documenting everything since my arrival, she continued. Her voice was level, factual, the way you'd recite vital signs. The Admiral's investigation into the supply theft wasn't about missing inventory. It was about following the money to whoever was facilitating the theft. That was you, Doctor. It was always you. She turned toward the exit, the cardboard box still steady in her arms. The unit patch remained hidden against her chest, sewn into the jacket lining where it had waited for this moment. By the way, she added, not looking back, Naval Criminal Investigative Service doesn't call ahead. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as she walked toward the parking lot. Behind her, Pierce was opening his mouth, closing it, looking at the lawyers with the expression of a man watching his entire world compress into a single point and disappear. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as she walked toward the parking lot. Behind her, Pierce was opening his mouth, closing it, looking at the lawyers with the expression of a man watching his entire world compress into a single point and disappear. But Natalie wouldn't see that moment stretch into hours. She wouldn't watch him scramble or calculate or begin to plan his escape. Because at 01 for 7 hours, Admiral Voss's monitor would stop singing. She made her final check on him at 1:44 a.m., moving through the ICU with the deliberate quiet of someone who'd already said goodbye. The Admiral lay in the darkened bay, his chest rising and falling under the careful pressure of bandages that were supposed to hold him together for another 6 weeks. The wound from the IED in Baghdad had been deep, shrapnel through muscle and fascia, missing his heart by centimeters. Surgical repair. Rest. Time. That was the timeline everyone believed in. Natalie stood at the foot of his bed and let her eyes trace the monitors once more. Sinus rhythm. BP stable. O2 sat 97%. Everything the machine said was, he would live. Then the monitor screamed. The cardiac alarm shrieked at a pitch designed to trigger every medical professional within 200 yards. Natalie's hands were moving before her conscious mind caught up. She didn't run, runners lose control, waste energy, arrive panicked. She walked. Fast. Precise. Her jaw clenched once, released, and tightened again as her muscles remembered what her conscience had been trying to forget. The charge nurse at the crash cart was already frozen, her hand hovering over the defibrillator pads as if she couldn't quite commit to touching them. A resident appeared from somewhere, looking at Natalie like she might have answers, which meant he was younger than 25 and this was probably his first code blue that mattered. What happened? Someone asked. Natalie didn't answer. She was already reading the monitor, the rhythm wild and chaotic, the kind of electrical storm that happens when internal bleeding ruptures through surgical seals. The Admiral's chest wound. The one they'd repaired. The one that wasn't supposed to fail for another month and a half. The on-call surgeon was 20 minutes out. Maybe 19 now. Maybe less if traffic was merciful. She reached the crash cart and grabbed the scalpel with the kind of certainty that made the charge nurse step backward. Not a request. Not a question. A hand moving with the muscle memory of 23 field surgeries, most of them intense, lit by chemical glow sticks while mortars whistled overhead, while the smell of diesel and copper and burnt flesh pressed so close you couldn't separate one from the other. Call security, someone said. Natalie was already past them, already at the Admiral's bedside, her hands moving through the antiseptic wipe and into the incision site with movements that didn't match anything Cedar Creek Medical had ever seen from a floor nurse. The scalpel bit through skin with the same precision it had in Fallujah, Helmand, and 3 other places that didn't have names in the unclassified files. She wasn't thinking about naval intelligence. She wasn't thinking about her cover or her handler or the mission she was supposed to salvage by walking away. She was thinking about anatomy. About where the bleeding was and how long the heart could sustain on a body that was emptying its blood supply faster than a shattered vessel should allow. The sternum cracked open with a sound like greenwood breaking. Clamp. Now, she said, her voice dropping 2 octaves, and a resident moved before his brain caught up. Her hand slipped into the Admiral's chest cavity, past ribs, past tissue, into the dark red architecture of a body trying to die. The wound was clear, the surgical repair had held until something small had torn it open from the inside. An infection. A structural failure. Bad luck. She didn't have time for the why. Her fingers found the bleeding source, applied pressure with the certainty of someone who'd done this while the ground shook. A resident's hand trembled as he positioned the retractor. She let the trembling exist for exactly 2 seconds, then said, "Steady," and the trembling stopped. That was the command structure in her voice. That was the thing she hid beneath the careful submission of her Cedar Creek persona. Suction. The sound of liquid being pulled away, revealing the work beneath. The rupture was small, the kind of thing that would have killed him in 4 minutes if she hadn't been standing there. For minutes and 18 seconds. That's how long the manual cardiac compression took. Her hand replacing the heart's function, feeling it pump under her palm, learning its rhythm and taking over when the rhythm wanted to quit. A resident sutured beneath her direction while she maintained pressure, while her voice continued giving orders that made people twice her seniority obey without question. Smaller sutures. You're tearing tissue. Clamp the lower bleeder. Keep the retraction steady. Yes, like that. Don't stop now. The Admiral's rhythm stabilized. The monitor beeped its normal song again. 02 Sat-climbed, 82. 89, 94. The heart under her palm steadied, took over its own work, decided to keep beating. She was closing the incision when the on-call surgeon arrived, his face flushed from running, taking in the scene and freezing exactly the way she'd known he would. A thoracotomy. Unauthorized. Performed by someone in scrubs with blood on her hands and the kind of composure that didn't belong in a civilian hospital. Dr. Pierce arrived 30 seconds later. His face went purple first, then the color drained entirely, leaving something closer to ash. He looked at the Admiral. He looked at Natalie. He looked at the surgical site and the closed incision and her hands that were already moving to clean, to step back, to surrender to whatever came next. "Get her out of here," he screamed at the security guards who were already moving toward her. She just committed assault. Unauthorized surgery. I want her arrested. 2 guards pulled her away from the table. Their hands on her arms were gentle, almost apologetic. The kind of grip that people use when they're following orders but they know something's wrong. The on-call surgeon took over the closure, continuing her work with the expression of a man doing something he didn't quite understand. Natalie let herself be pulled away from the bedside. She let herself be escorted from the ICU. But she watched Pierce's face as she left, watched him step to the Admiral's side and lean down, his hand reaching for the medical records. That's when she knew. He wasn't angry because she'd violated protocol. He was terrified because she'd seen the medication dosages that didn't match the drugs administered. The supply chain gaps. The phantom charges that had funded a pharmaceutical kickback scheme so elaborate that only someone trained to detect military fraud would have noticed it. She'd saved the Admiral's life, which meant she'd blown her cover, which meant naval intelligence was going to pull her within hours, which meant Dr. Pierce's scheme would collapse the moment her handler ran the investigation she'd compiled over 8 months. Her handler's voice on the extraction call was ice. Mission abort. 5 months. 5 months of documentation, Hayes, and you broke cover for what? A man's life? You know how many people we'll lose when this network figures out what happened? She didn't answer. She was already out of the hospital, already in her car, already driving back to the small house in Atlanta where her 14-year-old son was sleeping through the night his mother's career ended. That evening, she sat at their kitchen table in the dark. Marcus found her there at 6 a.m., still in scrubs, the Admiral's blood dried on the cuffs like rust. She hadn't changed. Hadn't showered. Hadn't moved. Mom. His voice was small. Uncertain. The voice of a child noticing that his mother was broken in a way he couldn't fix. She couldn't look at him. Why are you home early? He asked. She had no answer he'd understand. She had no way to explain that saving a life meant losing everything, that the Admiral was supposed to be her watch, her intelligence asset, her mission objective, and that his pulse under her fingers had meant more than her cover, her rank, or the future she'd built across 8 careful months. 3 days later, everything changed. The administrative hearing room at Cedar Creek was cold in the way conference rooms always are, fluorescent lights, air conditioning set to Arctic, mahogany table that probably cost more than Natalie's monthly mortgage. Dr. Pierce sat with hospital counsel on one side. Natalie sat alone with a public defender on the other. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard like a pianist waiting for the first note. Captain Hayes performed an unauthorized surgical procedure, Pierce was saying, his voice recovered to its normal cadence, all the purple rage replaced by practiced concern. She endangered the Admiral's life with reckless. The conference room door opened. Marcus walked in carrying a show box. 14 years old, wearing his middle school uniform, his face set with a determination that looked borrowed from someone else. Someone older. Someone who'd learned to fight in ways that didn't involve fists. "Mom, they need to see these," he said. He poured the contents onto the mahogany table. A silver star clattering first, its ribbon catching the light. Then a bronze star with Valor. A purple heart. Another purple heart. A faded unit patch from the 7th Medical Battalion, the stitching loose on one corner from 8 months of being sewn inside a jacket lining. The room went silent in the way rooms do when everything they understand about a person evaporates in approximately 2 seconds. Pierce stared at the medals like they were weapons. The hospital attorney's pen fell from her hand and rolled across the mahogany. The board members who'd been about to vote to prosecute looked at each other with expressions that suggested they'd suddenly realized they were way out of their depth. The conference room monitor flickered to life. Admiral Richard Voss appeared on screen, still in his hospital bed, his voice hoarse but clear, Reaper 6. Natalie didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't acknowledge the name that was hers in a different life, in a different uniform, in a context that Cedar Creek Medical had no framework to understand. The hospital attorney picked up the Silver Star citation with trembling hands and began to read, "Captain Natalie Hayes, United States Navy, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Baghdad, performing emergency field surgery under direct enemy fire, 23 documented procedures, sustained wounds consistent with." Pierce lunged for the citation. "This is fraud," he was saying, his voice cracking. "She's a nurse. Stolen Valor. This is..." The door opened again. A 2-star Navy general in dress blues entered first, his uniform so sharp it looked like it could cut. 2 NCIS agents followed, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that made security guards want to stand at attention. Every person in the room except Natalie stood. The general surveyed the medals on the mahogany table. He looked at Captain Hayes. He raised his right hand and saluted the medals with parade ground precision, the kind of motion that had protocol written into every degree of movement. "Captain Hayes," he said, his voice cutting through Pierce's protests like a blade through water. "Naval Intelligence sends their regards. The operation you thought you'd compromised? Your sacrifice gave Admiral Voss 6 more hours of consciousness. He used them to document everything. The medication fraud. The billing schemes. The contractor connections. Your mission succeeded the moment you made that incision." The first NCIS agent stepped forward, her expression neutral but her presence heavy with consequences. "Dr. Pierce, the internal audit you demanded to justify Captain Hayes' termination triggered a full investigation of the hospital's supply chain. We've traced $2.3 million in phantom pharmaceutical billings, falsified supply records, and kickbacks that match exactly the pipeline Captain Hayes was sent to document." The second agent produced handcuffs with a sound like promise. Pierce's face had gone so white it looked like the color had been bleached away. He was backing toward the window as if escape might exist somewhere beyond the glass, as if he might simply step through into a version of today where he'd never met the quiet night nurse with scarred hands and the precision of someone who'd learned medicine under circumstances Cedar Creek Medical couldn't imagine. Admiral Voss's voice came through the monitor, steady now, no longer hoarse, the quietest person in the room was holding it all together. We just couldn't see it. 3 days later, the fourth-floor conference room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like old wood polish and the particular kind of silence that comes before everything changes. Dr. Pierce sat at the mahogany table with the hospital's legal counsel on his left and 3 board members arranged like judges at a tribunal. They were discussing protocol violations and unauthorized procedures and patient safety liability when the door opened and a 14-year-old boy in a school uniform walked in carrying a showbox. Marcus Hayes didn't ask permission. He set the box on the conference table, directly in front of his mother, and began pouring its contents onto the polished surface. The medals fell like coins from a fountain, each one hitting the table with a sound like a gavel strike. Silver star. Bronze star with Valor. Purple heart. Purple heart again. The light caught them and threw fractured rainbows across the faces of everyone in the room. "They need to see these, Mom," Marcus said. His voice didn't shake. Dr. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. His hand reached toward one of the medals and froze halfway there, as if the objects themselves might burn him. The hospital attorney leaned back in her chair, her pen stopping mid-note. The video screen on the wall flickered to life. Admiral Richard Voss's face appeared, still pale but conscious, still alive because of 4 minutes at 01 for 7 hours on a night shift that wasn't supposed to matter. His voice came through the speakers, thin from morphine and months of recovery, but steady as a command frequency. "Reaper 6, he whispered. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum overhead, that particular electronic song of institutional buildings that nobody notices until silence demands they listen. Reaper 6. The call sign. The identity. The thing that had lived inside Natalie Hayes like a second heartbeat for 8 months while she asked about pharmaceutical inventories and made notations in charts and waited for the right moment to document the theft pipeline that had wounded the man on the screen. The hospital's attorney cleared her throat. She picked up a folder, the citation document. Her voice came out measured, professional, the kind of tone people use when reading things that will rewrite everyone's understanding of what just happened. Captain Natalie Hayes, United States Navy, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Baghdad, performing 23 field surgeries under direct enemy fire while maintaining operational security protocols and training forward-deployed medical personnel in trauma response procedures that saved 217 lives across 3 theater tours. The attorney paused. Her eyes moved to Natalie. "That's who you fired. For saving Admiral Voss." Dr. Pierce stood up. His voice came out in a rush, like a dam breaking. Those medals could be fraudulent. She could have fabricated credentials. The unauthorized thoracotomy alone, she attacked a patient with a surgical blade. This is a conspiracy. I demand an investigation into. The door opened again. A 2-star general in service dress blues walked in like he was walking into a briefing room, not a hospital conference room. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the medals on the table, and then at Captain Natalie Hayes, and his right hand came up in a salute with the precision of someone who had earned that rank through decades of command. His fist struck his chest like a promise. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the general's presence had changed the air pressure. His raised hand came up once, just once, and Dr. Pierce stopped talking mid-sentence. The gesture said everything: be silent, or I will make you silent, and you will not enjoy the experience. Those are real, the general said quietly. I know because I signed the commendations that came with them. Dr. Pierce, you're about to meet the part of this story where federal criminal investigators arrive. 2 Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents entered behind him. One carried a laptop. One carried a file folder that was exactly 3 inches thick. They sat down across from Dr. Pierce with the casual efficiency of people who had done this 40 times before. We're going to discuss your relationship with Helix Medical Supply, the first agent said. She opened the laptop. Specifically, 18 months of pharmaceutical billing patterns that don't match patient records. Drugs billed to military patients that were never administered. Payments deposited into your personal account, 5 separate accounts, actually, that match exactly to the amount variance between what you charged and what patients received. Dr. Pierce's hands were shaking now. Actually shaking. The tremor wasn't fear, it was the physical reality of understanding that every carefully constructed layer of his scheme had just been peeled back in front of witnesses. The second agent produced a printed email. March 14th, 8 months ago. Your message to Helix Supply: make sure the Baghdad shipments clear customs before the Navy audit team arrives. We can't afford another Voss situation. Do you remember writing this? I didn't know what they were doing with the 63 phone calls, the first agent interrupted. 63 documented calls between your number and Helix's logistics coordinator. We have records of you specifically routing military patients to Cedar Creek for treatment that would allow you to bill high-cost medications that would then be diverted through the contractor's supply chain. Some of those diverted drugs ended up in Baghdad. The same Baghdad where Admiral Voss was investigating the theft pipeline you were feeding. Natalie stood up for the first time since the medals fell on the table. When she spoke, her voice had changed. The deferential night nurse was gone. What remained was someone who had seen combat, performed surgery under mortar fire, and spent 8 months holding a cover story with the discipline of a submarine commander. Her voice came out like a command frequency. You weren't just stealing medication, Dr. Pierce, she said. You were supplying the same insurgent networks who wounded the patients you were supposed to treat. Admiral Voss was in Baghdad investigating pharmaceutical theft. You were feeding the people who were attacking him. That's not a financial crime. That's a weapon supply operation that happened to run through a hospital. The hospital board members pushed away from the table in unison, as if proximity to Dr. Pierce had suddenly become a liability. One of them, the board chair, looked directly at the 2-star general. His medical license, she said. It wasn't a question. Suspended immediately upon federal notification, the general said. Which happened 46 minutes ago. Criminal charges follow within the hour. Fraud, conspiracy, material support to hostile forces through negligence. The Justice Department is already notifying his malpractice insurance carrier that coverage is null and void. His attorney is on the way to advise him that his best option is a plea agreement. Dr. Pierce's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating in air. His career wasn't just ending. It was being carefully dismantled, piece by piece, in front of witnesses, in front of the person he had tried to destroy, in front of the military official who outranked everyone in the room by virtue of both position and the authority that came from knowing exactly what was about to happen next. Marcus watched his mother's face during all of this. He was old enough now to understand that the woman standing in that conference room was not the same person who had come home crying in her scrubs for weeks ago. The mask had come off completely. Captain Natalie Hayes was visible now, not the version of her that asked polite questions about inventory procedures, but the version that had performed surgery in a field hospital while incoming fire made the walls shudder. The version that had trained medics how to save lives under conditions that would break most people. The version that had been sent to Cedar Creek to be invisible, and had been so good at invisibility that nobody, not even the man who fired her, had realized they were firing a warrior. 6 months of legal proceedings followed. Dr. Pierce accepted a plea agreement that saved him from a trial where military prosecutors would have presented evidence of not just fraud, but conspiracy charges that carried much longer sentences. His medical license was permanently revoked. His assets were seized for restitution totaling $2.3 million. His name was struck from every hospital database, every professional organization, every medical journal in the country. He became the kind of person that physicians pointed to in ethics seminars, the example of what happens when ambition and greed override the oath you took. Then came the after part. The part where Natalie's life became something else entirely. Marcus stepped off the elevator at Bethesda Naval Hospital 6 months later, his mother's new command. She'd been promoted, not just restored, but promoted, to lead the medical fraud prevention program across all military healthcare networks. Her office was on the 4th floor, corner window overlooking the Potomac, the kind of space that came with the rank of captain and the authority to command respect just by walking into a room. The faded 7th Medical Battalion unit patch hung framed on her wall. The patch was worn now, its colors faded to something like watercolor, and beside it hung a photograph of Marcus in his Naval Academy dress whites. Admiral Voss had personally sponsored his appointment. He'd stood in her office 3 months after his discharge and said, "Your son saved my life by being born to you. Let me return the favor." Marcus and his mother walked through the hospital loading area on their way to the cafeteria. A man in civilian clothes was backing a medical supply van toward the loading dock. He wore a federal marshal's badge clipped to his belt. Dr. Pierce looked up as they passed. His face had aged 10 years in 6 months, the kind of deterioration that comes from understanding exactly what you lost. He was required to work in military medical logistics for 8 years. Every shipment audited. Every transaction monitored. $12 an hour. The kind of punishment that wasn't prison, exactly, but wasn't freedom either. He looked at Captain Natalie Hayes in her navy dress blues. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't need to. The message was silent and absolute. I tried to destroy you, and instead I showed everyone who you really are. Inside the conference room, Natalie stood in front of a room full of senior military medical officers, colonels, commanders, 2 generals. She was briefing them on healthcare fraud prevention, using Cedar Creek as the primary case study. The projection screen behind her showed the flow chart of Dr. Pierce's scheme, the pharmaceutical diversion, the contractor connections, the Baghdad connections, the full scope of how one doctor's corruption had nearly destabilized an entire military supply chain. Admiral Voss sat in the front row. He was in dress blues now, fully recovered, his presence carrying the weight of someone who had almost died and survived because a Navy operative had broken her cover to save him. Captain Hayes was sent to Cedar Creek to be invisible, the Admiral said when the briefing finished. Her job was to document a supply theft without being detected. But when I went into cardiac arrest, she chose to be seen. She chose to reveal herself. She chose to break her mission because saving one life mattered more than protecting an operation. That's discipline. That's the kind of heroism we don't train for, because it exists outside protocols. After the briefing, Marcus asked his mother the question he'd been holding for 6 months, "Do you regret it? Breaking your cover? Ending the mission?" Natalie touched the framed unit patch on her office wall. Her fingers traced the faded blue of the battalion insignia. "I was sent to document a supply theft," she said. "But I'm a surgeon first. A sailor second. A spy only when I have to be." Admiral Voss needed for minutes of surgery more than naval intelligence needed another photograph. The mission didn't fail, Marcus. It succeeded. We documented the corruption. We stopped the supply pipeline. The fact that I revealed myself to do it just meant I had to finish the mission from a different angle. She turned to face him. Her eyes were the color of a winter morning, clear, steady, carrying the weight of things seen and survived. "You're going to be an officer now," she said. "You're going to have people under your command who seem average. Who ask quiet questions. Who don't draw attention. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Remember that when you're the loud one." Outside, Dr. Pierce loaded another box of medical supplies into the van under the observation of 2 federal marshals. The weight of what he'd lost was heavier than anything he carried. If you made it this far, you understand why I upload these stories. Because heroes don't always wear uniforms you can see. Sometimes they wear scrubs. Sometimes they're invisible until the moment they have to be seen. Subscribe to see more stories like Natalie's, stories about the quiet ones who change everything.